People have fundamentally misunderstood what an empath becomes. They see the sensitivity, they see the compassion, they see the person who feels deeply, who absorbs quietly, who bends repeatedly to maintain peace. And from that image, they draw a conclusion. That empaths are soft, that their nature makes them manageable, that their kindness is a permanent condition without limit or consequence. That conclusion is one of the most dangerous misreadings a person can make, because what most people observe in an empath is not who they are. It is who they were trained to be, and training, when it finally breaks, reveals something underneath that very few people are prepared for. This is what awakening actually means, not a spiritual event, not a dramatic transformation visible from the outside. Awakening in the empath is quieter than that. It is the moment the internal architecture shifts, the moment the system that was built for survival begins dismantling itself in favor of something more fundamental. Truth, clarity, sovereignty. And once that shift begins, everything changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. To understand why an awakened empath is so formidable, you first have to understand what they were before, because the before is not weakness. It is compressed intelligence waiting for the right conditions to expand. Most empaths begin life in environments where emotional attunement was not a gift. It was a necessity. They learned to read rooms not because they wanted to master people, but because misreading the room carried consequences. They developed an almost automatic system of monitoring, anticipating, adjusting. They became extraordinarily sensitive to contradiction, to shifts in tone, to the space between what someone said and what their nervous system was actually communicating. And they did this before they had language for it. That is important. Because the skills an empath develops early are not conscious skills. They are embedded. They are wired into the way the empath processes the world, which means by the time they reach adulthood, they are operating with a level of perceptual depth most people never consciously develop. Consider what that actually involves at the neurological level. A child learning to read a parent's footsteps in the hallway. A child distinguishing between a sigh that means tiredness and a sigh that means an oncoming storm. A child who learns to soften their own breathing because the room cannot tolerate sound. None of this is taught. None of this is rehearsed. It is absorbed. It becomes part of the body itself, encoded in the muscles, the posture, the way the eyes move when another person enters a space. By adolescence, this system is fully operational. By adulthood, it has become invisible to the person who carries it. They do not realize they are scanning. They do not realize they are calibrating. They simply experience the world as a place that requires constant adjustment, and they assume everyone else is experiencing it the same way. They are not. That is one of the first quiet revelations of awakening. The recognition that what felt like a universal human task, managing the emotional weather of every room, was in fact a private burden carried by a small percentage of people who were trained into it before they could refuse. But here is the problem that forms. Those skills were placed entirely in service of others. They were used to maintain harmony, to prevent conflict, to stabilize environments that were never the empath's responsibility to stabilize. And so the empath never turned those same perceptual tools inward, never used that extraordinary awareness to examine their own patterns, their own limits, their own worth. They were too busy managing everyone else. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this. It is not the exhaustion of overwork. It is the exhaustion of perpetual outward orientation. The exhaustion of a system that has been running diagnostics on the entire room while never once turning the same precision toward its own internal state. And that exhaustion accumulates without showing itself because the empath has also been trained to absorb fatigue silently, to perform wellness, to keep functioning even when the internal reserves have long since collapsed. This is where the trap forms. And it is not a trap built from weakness. It is a trap built from competence, because empaths become extraordinarily effective at emotional management. And that effectiveness produces reinforcement. People rely on them. People turn to them. People lean into the comfort they provide and unconsciously resist anything that might disrupt that arrangement. So the empath learns, even without realizing it, that their value is located in their usefulness. That being needed is what makes them safe. That maintaining peace even at significant personal cost is simply the price of belonging. And for years, sometimes decades, they pay it. They overgive. They overextend. They absorb emotions that were never theirs to carry. They stay in dynamics long past the point of alignment. They rationalize, adjust, accommodate, not because they are naive, but because they believe somewhere beneath conscious thought that this is what love requires, that this is what being good demands. That belief is the foundation of the trap, and the trap eventually breaks, but before it breaks, it deepens. That is something rarely spoken about. The trap does not stay static. It refines itself over time. The empath becomes more skilled at suppression, more graceful at self-erasure, more practiced at performing presence, while their actual self quietly retreats further into the interior. They become so adept at being who others need that they begin to lose the thread of who they are when no one is watching. There is a specific moment, often unnoticed, when this drift becomes critical. It is the moment the empath, alone with themselves, no longer recognizes their own preferences. They cannot decide what they want for dinner. They cannot identify what music they actually like. They cannot answer a simple question about how they feel without first checking what answer would be most acceptable to the person asking. The self has become so accustomed to deferral that even in privacy, it continues to defer. This is the deepest layer of the trap, the point at which accommodation has become identity, where giving has become not a choice but a reflex, where the empath is no longer a person who happens to be generous but a generosity that happens to wear a person's shape. And it is precisely here, at this farthest distance from the self, that the reversal begins. It does not break dramatically. There is rarely a single moment. It is more like erosion working in reverse, a slow accumulation of clarity. Each betrayal that goes unacknowledged, each boundary that gets ignored, each moment where the empath extended themselves fully and received nothing in return. These do not disappear, they accumulate. They form a residue of understanding that no amount of rationalization can dissolve. And one day, something inside the empath stops. Not their compassion, not their depth, not their capacity to feel. Something else stops. The willingness to participate in their own diminishment. The tolerance for environments that require them to abandon themselves in order to belong. The belief that their needs are secondary to everyone else's comfort. That stopping is the beginning of awakening. And awakening changes the nature of every skill the empath possesses, but the stopping itself deserves closer attention, because it is not a decision in the conventional sense. It is not arrived at through pros and cons, through deliberation, through advice from others. It arrives almost as a physical event. The body simply refuses. The nervous system reaches a threshold and declines to continue. Words that used to come automatically, the apologies, the smoothing remarks, the reassurances, fail to arrive on cue. The mouth stays closed. The hand does not reach. The yes does not form. For the empath, this can be disorienting because they have spent their entire life producing those responses without effort. To suddenly find them absent is to encounter a stranger inside themselves. Not a hostile stranger, not a wounded one, simply a different one. A self that has been waiting beneath the performance and has finally decided the performance is over. And there is a quiet grief in this transition that is rarely named. The empath is, in some sense, mourning themselves that worked so hard to be acceptable. That version was not entirely false. It carried real love, it made real sacrifices. But it was also incomplete, and its retirement is necessary for the fuller self to emerge. To honor both, the loyalty of the old self and the necessity of its retirement, is part of what awakening requires. Think about what that means. A person who spent years learning to read emotional undercurrents, to detect contradiction, to sense what is real beneath what is performed, now stops using those skills in service of maintaining peace and starts using them in service of truth. That is a profound shift in orientation. Because the same perception that once helped the empath accommodate others now helps them see with absolute clarity who those others actually are. The same attunement that once made them vulnerable to manipulation now makes them nearly impossible to manipulate. The same depth that once made them easy to exploit now makes them extraordinarily difficult to deceive, because they have seen these patterns before. They lived inside them. They absorbed them at a cellular level, and now they recognize them immediately, often before the other person has finished constructing the performance. This is the first dimension of the awakened empath's power. Pattern recognition without sentimentality. To grasp the weight of this, consider how most pattern recognition fails in human relationships. It fails not because people cannot see patterns, but because they cannot bear to acknowledge them. The brain registers the inconsistency, the betrayal, the manipulation, but the heart, still invested in a particular story, refuses to let that registration rise into conscious admission. So the pattern is detected and immediately buried, detected and rationalized, detected and reframed into something more tolerable. The awakened empath has lost the capacity to bury. That is what awakening costs and grants. The pattern is detected, and it is allowed to remain visible. It is not weaponized. It is not used to attack. It is simply seen, named internally, and acted upon. There is no longer a gap between what the perception delivers and what the self is willing to receive. That gap, in most people, is the entire territory in which manipulation operates. Close it, and manipulation has nowhere to live. Most people are controlled by their desire to be wrong about others. They want to believe the best. They want the story to be good. They extend benefit of the doubt not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative is too uncomfortable to accept. This is human. This is understandable, but it is also a vulnerability. The awakened empath has largely moved past it, not into cynicism. That distinction is essential. Cynicism assumes the worst as a default. Discernment sees clearly regardless of what the truth turns out to be. One is a defense mechanism. The other is perception. And the awakened empath moves toward perception. They stop needing the story to be comfortable. They stop requiring reality to be different from what it is. And when you no longer need reality to be different, you see it with a precision most people never reach. You notice when warmth is rehearsed. You notice when apology is strategic. You notice when someone's behavior pattern contradicts their stated values, not once but consistently, as a structure, as a way of operating. And you adjust accordingly. Without drama, without announcement. Without giving the other person the opportunity to manage your perception of them. That quiet adjustment is one of the most powerful things a human being can do, because it removes the leverage that manipulation depends on, and manipulation without leverage collapses. There is a reason this disturbs people who relied on the old arrangement, because most relational manipulation depends on the target's continued willingness to argue, to defend themselves, to seek validation, to negotiate the meaning of what just happened. Each of those engagements gives the manipulator material to work with. Each of them creates an opening. The awakened empath simply stops engaging at that level. The behavior is observed, the conclusion is formed, and the response is structural rather than verbal. They do not announce the recalibration. They simply become unavailable in the precise way that closes the loop the other person was depending on. This is not coldness. It is the absence of the labor that used to be invisible. The labor of maintaining a connection that was already broken at the foundation. When that labor stops, what remains is what was actually there all along. Now here is where it becomes even more significant. The awakened empath does not just see through performance. They understand the psychology beneath it, because they have lived inside similar emotions themselves. They have felt fear disguised as confidence. They have felt insecurity masked as criticism. They have felt shame performing as superiority. And because they have felt these things, they can recognize them in others with an accuracy that is almost uncomfortable to witness. This creates something unusual. The awakened empath can simultaneously understand why someone behaves destructively and refuse to be affected by it. They can hold compassion for the wound that produces harmful behavior while maintaining absolute clarity that the behavior itself is unacceptable. Most people cannot hold both of those things at once. They either collapse into endless understanding that enables harm, or they harden into judgment that forecloses compassion. The awakened empath does neither. They see clearly and remain human. That combination is rare, and rare things carry influence. It is worth pausing on this duality, because it is the central paradox of the awakened state. Compassion without clarity becomes complicity. Clarity without compassion becomes contempt. Most people, when wounded enough, swing from one pole to the other. They spend years being too understanding, then suddenly become harsh, suspicious, closed. That oscillation is itself a sign that integration has not yet occurred. The awakened empath has integrated. They have learned that understanding the cause of behavior does not require accepting its consequences. That seeing the wounded child inside the adult does not obligate them to absorb that adult's harm. That compassion is something they offer from a position of choice, not from a position of obligation, and that choice can include holding distance, holding silence, holding the door closed without slamming it. This is mature compassion. Compassion with structure. And it is profoundly different from the unconditional emotional availability that defined the empath's earlier life. But perhaps the most formidable dimension of the awakened empath is not perception. It is silence. Because there is a particular kind of silence that emerges after an empath has processed enough. Not the silence of confusion, not the silence of defeat, the silence of resolution. And that silence is qualitatively different from anything that came before it. Earlier in life, the empath's silence was often the silence of suppression. They stayed quiet because they were managing the emotional environment. Because speaking would disrupt the peace they had worked so hard to maintain. Because their truth felt like a burden others shouldn't have to carry. That silence was accommodation. The silence of the awakened empath is something else entirely. It is the silence of someone who no longer requires external validation for what they know, who no longer needs their reality confirmed by the person who denied it, who has stopped trying to convince those committed to misunderstanding them. This silence does not seek attention. It withdraws it. It does not threaten consequences. It becomes one. And this is what unsettles people who encounter it, because they expected engagement. They expected the empath to continue explaining, arguing, pursuing, seeking closure. They built their entire strategy around the empath's continued emotional investment. And when that investment disappears, the strategy has nothing to operate on. That is power, not the power of aggression, the power of non-participation, the power of refusing to remain in a dynamic that requires self-betrayal as the cost of entry. There is also a deeper layer to this silence that is worth naming. It is the silence that comes from understanding that some truths cannot be transferred, that certain forms of clarity are not arguments to be won, but recognitions to be lived. The empath, having reached a particular threshold of inner certainty, no longer feels the need to export that certainty into other people's awareness. They are not on a mission to convert. They are not waiting to be understood. They have moved past the stage where being understood was the precondition of being whole. This is the difference between the silence of someone still hoping to be heard and the silence of someone who has accepted that being heard is not the criterion of their wholeness. The first silence is heavy with unspoken sentences. The second is light because the sentences have been released. They were never owed to anyone in the first place. There is something else that happens in awakening that rarely gets named directly. The empath reclaims their energy. For years, possibly decades, that energy went outward, constantly, into managing, absorbing, accommodating, overextending across relationships and environments that were taking without reciprocating. The empath's internal resources were perpetually depleted because they were perpetually distributed without discernment. Awakening reverses that direction. And the accumulation that results is significant. Because an empath who is no longer hemorrhaging energy into misaligned dynamics suddenly has access to reserves they forgot existed. Focus sharpens, clarity deepens, creative capacity returns. The internal noise that came from carrying other people's emotions without permission begins to quiet, and in that quiet, something powerful emerges. The empath begins to hear themselves, their own preferences, their own direction, their own sense of what matters and why. Things that were always present but impossible to access beneath the constant demand of external orientation. This is where identity solidifies. And identity, once solid, is extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. Because the person who knows who they are cannot be easily told otherwise, cannot be destabilized by guilt, cannot be controlled by the threat of withdrawal, cannot be redirected by performance or pressure. They know their own ground. And knowing your own ground is the foundation of every other form of power. It is worth noticing how this energy returns. It does not arrive as a surge. It arrives as a slow refilling, almost imperceptible at first, the way a well returns to itself after the drought ends. The empath begins to notice that mornings feel different, that conversations no longer leave a residue, that the people they spend time with no longer require recovery afterwards, that sleep becomes deeper, that their own thoughts become audible again, no longer drowned beneath the imported noise of everyone they have been emotionally subsidizing. And as this energy returns, the empath often discovers that abilities they thought they had lost were never truly lost. They were simply unfunded. The creativity that seemed to fade was starved of attention. The intuition that seemed to grow unreliable was overwhelmed by competing signals. The clarity that seemed to dim was occluded by the perpetual emotional weather of others. Restore the energy, and these faculties return, often sharper than before, because now they are operating on behalf of the self that owns them rather than the environment that was draining them. Now consider what this means for the people who once assumed the empath was manageable. They had built an entire relational architecture around a version of the empath that no longer exists, an architecture that depended on guilt functioning as leverage, that depended on the empath's need for approval being exploitable, that depended on their compassion being available without limit or accountability. And now they are dealing with someone who has outgrown all of those dependencies. This is why people who underestimated the empath are often the most destabilized when awakening occurs. Not because the empath becomes cruel, but because the empath becomes precise, and precision removes the ambiguity that manipulation depends on. There is no longer any room to misrepresent, no longer any gap between what the empath feels and what they are willing to name. No longer any tolerance for dynamics sustained by their overextension rather than genuine reciprocity. The math of the relationship changes completely, and those who benefited from the old math have nothing left to work with. What follows is often predictable. There is escalation. There are attempts to provoke the old responses. There is sometimes a sudden theatrical display of the very qualities the empath used to long for. Attention, warmth, recognition, offered now in concentrated form, as if to demonstrate that the connection was always there, simply withheld until necessary. The awakened empath observes these performances without contempt and without illusion. They recognize them for what they are: last efforts, closing arguments in a case that has already been decided, and when the escalation fails, there is often a final stage, the reframing. The empath is recast as cold, as changed, as no longer the person they once were. This recasting is intended to provoke guilt, to reactivate the old machinery of self-doubt. But the awakened empath holds the reframing without absorbing it. They understand that being called cold by someone who benefited from your warmth being unreciprocated is not an indictment. It is confirmation. It is the final piece of evidence that the old arrangement was never balanced to begin with. But here is the dimension of awakened empath power that is perhaps the most philosophically significant. They stop fearing misunderstanding. This sounds simple. It is not. Because the fear of being misunderstood is one of the deepest fears in human psychology. It is connected to belonging, to acceptance, to the fundamental question of whether one is safe in relationship with others. And for an empath, someone whose entire early development was shaped by reading other people's emotional states, that fear was particularly acute. Being misunderstood once felt like rejection. Being disliked felt like danger. Being seen as difficult, cold, or selfish felt like a verdict on their worth. And that fear was one of the primary mechanisms through which the empath could be controlled. Remove the fear, and the mechanism stops working. The awakened empath reaches a place where they can be misunderstood without abandoning themselves, where they can be disliked without rewriting their values, where they can be seen as difficult by someone who benefited from their compliance and recognize that as information rather than injury. That tolerance for misunderstanding is not indifference. It is self-possession. And self-possession, once established, creates a kind of psychological sovereignty that is extraordinarily rare, because social control at its most fundamental level operates through insecurity, through the threat of exclusion, through the manipulation of self-doubt. And someone who has moved through those threats and out the other side is operating from a completely different foundation. They cannot be reached by the same levers that once moved them, and that changes every dynamic they are part of. It is important to understand that this freedom is not arrived at through indifference training, through pretending not to care, through cultivating a hardened exterior. It is arrived at through something more difficult and more durable, through the slow internal demonstration that one can survive being misunderstood, that the world does not end when someone gets the wrong impression, that the self continues to exist, intact and breathing, even when the mirror of another person's perception fails to reflect it accurately. This is something the empath learns one threshold at a time. The first time they hold a position despite being called cold for it. The first time they decline to explain themselves to someone who was not asking in good faith. The first time they let a relationship end without a final speech, because they realized the speech would be for the other person's benefit and not their own. Each of these moments is small. Each of them is in the moment uncomfortable. But each of them is also a brick in a foundation that, once laid, is nearly impossible to dismantle. This is what people fail to understand when they underestimate an empath. They see compassion and assume it is unlimited. They see patience and assume it is permanent. They see forgiveness and assume it is unconditional. And they build a strategy around those assumptions without realizing that each of those qualities has an internal limit. A threshold that once crossed does not reset. The empath who is awakened has crossed those thresholds. And what exists on the other side is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of clarity. And clarity, when fully embodied, is one of the most formidable states a human being can occupy, because the person who sees clearly cannot be fooled by appearances, cannot be redirected by charm, cannot be controlled by guilt, cannot be held in place by the fear of what leaving might cost them. They have already calculated the cost of staying, and they have chosen accordingly. This calculation is something most people never undertake honestly, because to calculate the cost of staying requires admitting what staying has already cost: the years, the opportunities not taken, the version of the self that was suppressed, the relationships not pursued because there was no energy left for them, The dreams not honored because every available resource was being routed into someone else's stability. To look at this ledger directly is painful. Most people refuse to. They prefer to keep the books closed and continue paying the invisible interest. The awakened empath has opened the ledger. They have read every line. And they have understood, with a precision that does not flinch, that continuing to pay would be a form of complicity in their own erasure. The decision that follows is not impulsive. It is not retaliatory. It is simply the only sane response to information that has been fully received. So when people ask why an awakened empath is different, why the energy in the room shifts when one walks in, why manipulation strategies that once worked suddenly find no purchase, the answer is not mystical, it is psychological. The awakened empath has converted decades of emotional experience into perception. They have transformed suffering into discernment. They have taken the very sensitivity that was once exploited and refined it into a faculty so precise that very little in human behavior escapes their awareness. And they are no longer afraid of what they see. That combination, depth of perception plus freedom from fear, is extraordinarily rare, and rare things carry a particular kind of power. Not the power of domination, not the power of control, the power of presence, the power of truth spoken without apology, the power of clarity that does not require consensus. The power of someone who has finally stopped performing safety for others and started embodying it for themselves. This embodiment is a quiet revolution. Because the empath who once made others feel safe at the cost of their own internal safety now becomes a person who is genuinely safe to be near. In the most accurate sense of the word, they are safe because they are not pretending. Safe because they will not flatter. Safe because they will not manipulate. Safe because what you see is what is actually there, and what is actually there has been earned through a process that did not skip any of the difficult steps. This is a different kind of safety than the empath used to provide. The old safety was the safety of being agreed with, soothed, accommodated. It felt good in the moment but left the recipient unchanged because nothing real had been transmitted. The new safety is the safety of being seen accurately by someone who will not flinch from what they see and will not weaponize it. That kind of safety is rare. It is also transformative. The people who can tolerate proximity to it tend to grow. The people who cannot tend to leave. And that sorting, while sometimes painful, is itself part of the gift the awakened empath now offers the world. And this is the final thing worth understanding. The empath does not become dangerous because they harden. They become dangerous because they integrate. Because they stop living divided against their own nature. Because they stop apologizing for their perception, their depth, their capacity to see what others miss. Because once an empath fully owns who they are, without reduction, without performance, without the constant management of how they are received, something shifts in every space they occupy. People feel it. Often before a word is spoken, there is a steadiness, a groundedness, a refusal to be destabilized by performances that once had power over them. And in a world where most people are operating from fear, insecurity, and the need for approval, someone who is operating from genuine inner sovereignty stands out in ways that are almost impossible to ignore. That is the awakened empath, not louder, not harder, not colder. Clearer and clarity, when fully inhabited, is perhaps the most dangerous thing a deeply feeling person can become, because it cannot be argued with, it cannot be manipulated, it cannot be confused, it simply sees. And once you are fully seen by someone who no longer fears what they find, everything changes, including you. There is a final reflection that belongs here, at the edge of everything that has been said. The awakened empath is not a destination but a way of standing in the world. It is not a state achieved once and held forever. It is a posture, renewed daily, that says, I will not return to who I was before I learned what I learned. I will not unsee what has been seen. I will not pretend for the comfort of anyone that the architecture of my inner life has not been rebuilt. This refusal to regress is what gives the awakened empath their durability. They are not impressive because they are loud. They are impressive because they are consistent. The same person in the room as in private. The same boundary in difficult moments as in easy ones. The same clarity under pressure as in stillness. That consistency, in a world that rewards performance over integrity, is itself a form of quiet resistance, and those who encounter such a person, even briefly, are often changed by the encounter without quite knowing why. Because the awakened empath does not impose. They simply exist as evidence. Evidence that another way of being is possible. Evidence that depth and discernment can coexist. Evidence that one can feel everything and still not lose themselves to it. That evidence, once received, becomes a question the receiver must eventually answer. About their own life, their own patterns, their own capacity for the kind of integration they have just witnessed. This is why the awakened empath disturbs some and inspires others. They are a mirror that does not lie, and the only thing the world ever truly fears is a mirror that refuses to distort. So when one walks into a room and the air seems to shift, when conversations suddenly find their honest tone, when the usual performances seem suddenly unviable, do not call it mystical. Call it what it is. A person has finished the long, quiet work of becoming themselves, and that, more than any louder thing, is what changes the world.